with that out of the way, let's get down to business. So Microsoft Intune consists of three pieces: MDM, Mobile Device Manager, MAM, Mobile Application Manager, and Autopilot, the ability to remotely apply desktop configurations and policies, again, remotely. So almost 2 years ago today, it was March 23rd, 2020, Governor Kate Brown put into effect the COVID-19 lockdown mandate and basically said everybody had to start working from their home. And about that exact same time, Microsoft launched Autopilot as part of their Intune suite. Talk about perfect timing. The issue was people needed their laptops configured to work from home, and they didn't want any tech showing up at their home or breathing all over their new equipment when they were configuring it. So a perfect solution was Autopilot, a way to remotely configure a client without ever having to physically touch it. That was key, no touching. So please sit back, relax, and let's hear our President and CEO, Matt Katzer, talk to us today about Autopilot and how to reduce your total cost of IT. Please take it away, Matt.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Thanks for the introduction. And hey, welcome, everyone. And welcome to Autopilot. And some little history with Autopilot. With KAMIND, we're a direct managed partner. And so we get into a lot of alpha and beta programs. So we actually been playing with Autopilot for a number of years. And one of the key features that we really like of Autopilot, especially when we have remote contractors, is that we can actually send them a laptop and then basically and totally have 100% control over the laptop, to the point that if the contractor, let's say you send it to lose it in their car or something like that, basically the unit itself cannot be reset. It's always going to return back into the out-of-box experience, and it's always going to be locked to the business. And from a business standpoint, you have 100% control over that asset. And that's kind of really key, especially in this world when you're talking about traveling, when you're talking about theft of devices and everything else. It's just totally changed the dynamics of how you manage things. And especially with all the compliance regulations and rules that we have on top of it, it really kind of puts a lot of things, solves a lot of problems. And so when we actually started down the Autopilot and using it for all our environments, it really supports what we need and can secure the data, because that's what everything's about at the end of the day. So a little bit about KAMIND, for those who don't know, is that for KAMIND, we're a Microsoft direct partner. We're at the third year on the Inc. 5000 as fastest growing companies. We're also one of the select few, less than 50 of the companies in the US that are basically allowed to sell the high-end government subscription for the security environment, known as GCC High. And I myself, I published wrote 3 books, and I have sold over 280,000 of Office 365 and how to configure. And so we're using a lot of those technologies, things that we actually do to actually help our clients and move our clients forward. At KAMIND, people ask us, why do we exist? And we really exist to prevent and solve big problems. That's what our mantra is. And we look at everything we try to do with how we actually try to deploy our security products, how we actually be proactive on it, how do we actually make sure the environments are secured, and how we actually manage those 40,000 plus licensees that we actually have out there. It's a lot of it about how do we actually do it through automation, and how do we actually do it through management. And the key component to actually manage the secured environments, and we all have this situation, is how do you actually want to manage, how do you want to actually get hardware, and how do you actually get hardware and software to new folks, is using Autopilot. And I really like from an Autopilot is basically, how it really works and the problems that it really solves for us. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit background of things that we kind of look at in terms of what we're dealing in the marketplace, but we're going to get into some more about how do you actually deploy it and how to actually do the configuration. And also we have some special offers to look at if you want to take advantage of this. But Autopilot basically is super critical, especially with all the compliance requirements that are placed on us. Can you imagine some of the DHS reportings that you hear that, You have a client from OSHU, for instance. They leave their laptop in a car, and then suddenly they have $100,000 or $200,000 fine because they have patient information on it. Now, if you had an environment like that with Autopilot, that was an Autopilot device, the IT administrator could immediately basically turn that device into a brick and basically reset and wipe the device of all the data. So you have an environment that basically is 100% controlled, that really is designed to protect what we want to protect most in our business, our digital assets. Because in this new modern age that we in, this post-COVID age that we're getting to, we have really transformed our businesses. And the business value that we have is our digital assets. And the business value that we want to maintain and keep from prying eyes seen, it's those internal processes, it's those trade secrets we use that make our business what we are. And that's kind of the things and the value that we brings to our clients. So when you look at the challenges and everything else and trying to figure out how do you actually solve this problem in a really highly compliant environment, you really have to look at in terms of what's going on. And I grabbed a few slides, Microsoft had prepared, and talking about the challenges in terms of how do you actually handling remote needs, and about what's really going on in terms of the environment. Also, how much do you actually look in terms of the ability to spend on processing? One of the biggest issues now is trying to get talent. So do you have spare resources that you actually want to basically allocate to imaging and providing devices, or do you want to basically automate that whole process? Automate it to the point that you can literally order the product from a manufacturer, ship it directly to an end user, and do all the remote configuration remotely, so that when the end user actually receives it, they just log in with their work email address and it auto configures. And those are the things that you're actually looking at in terms of day, especially, and add on top of this, a growing complexity of IT and security. I mean, you want to be able to do things in terms of remote devices. You may want to control plugging in USB. You may want to configure what types of apps are going to be available to configure on it. Control who has admin rights on it on a remote user. Control all that experience. So basically, you have a complete lockdown environment from day one, with literally no time spent on it. Now, historically, if you look at the amount of time that you would actually spend, you're spending roughly about trying to imaging and trying to build a system. It's roughly about 4 hours. And from the cost associated with it and the changes that you have to do, it's just phenomenal. And you start multiplying, saying that, well, I may have to go re-image this device 3 or 4 times this year. We may have to go replace devices. How do you actually handle that? And how do you actually look in terms of manage that in terms like the new Windows 10 and Windows 11 devices? So those devices are really secured. The data is basically secured by the company and owned by the company. And you actually structure it so you literally have the ability to replace those devices on the fly if needed with little or no effort. And that's the whole thing when you look in terms of Autopilot and the ability, because basically you want to enable people to work from any location. You want to make sure they have the right tools that your organization has approved, and you want to make sure that they're productive in terms of what you're deployed. And that's what the whole secret is. You look at this. So that's basically what Autopilot is. It's basically that zero total cost of ownership. So you basically get a device right off, you log right into it, and you basically are up and running. And you have a very simplified device management and basically no touch points. Like I said, literally you can go through and let's say you buy it from Autopilot vendors like Dell or Microsoft or HP, and you can actually get the necessary information from those vendors delivered to you so you can actually load them into your Office 365 environment. And when that device actually shows up at that end user's home, they basically log into the work account, set up their password, and the device automatically configures. And we're actually going to walk you through some of that. And you actually add on top of that the issues associated with device repurposing or reconfiguration. You have business policies that change. So you want to actually, traditionally, you want to change your old image. Well, guess what? Now you just change the profile and you actually push out those new changes directly out to all those devices all those devices that are managed that way. And so it gives you this easy way to actually manage and monitor those devices. And when you actually integrate, like in terms of the OneDrive, the OneDrive for Business that Microsoft has in 365, you have an environment where literally it's just like your phone. Those devices are throwaways. You can actually go out and basically purchase if something happened to a laptop that someone has, an Autopilot enabled laptop, it was failing, you could actually ship them a brand new one from the factory directly to that user, take the necessary configure information that the manufacturer will supply to you and configure it. So when the user actually sees it, they can log in, they're going to have their same environment, and also they'll start getting their environment restored, just like you would have like with any OneDrive environment now. That's how things have changed. And that's how it's really been optimized for 365. And when you start looking at these various pieces of how long it takes to get employees up and running, you can basically reduce this whole process. Literally, you get it down to minutes. Now, think about how you actually do productivity when you actually onboard new employees. You want to get them up to using the tools as fast as you can, and then you want to actually get to the point that you can focus them on what's important, which is basically the job. Move IT out of the way. That's what Autopilot really does for you. And it really is a difference, and it includes, it basically deploy devices that are ready to go from day one with little overhead from the IT organization. Now, you're talking about literally your zero touch. So if you actually have you're buying 1,000 or you're buying 1 to 1,000 or more systems, you can dynamically configure those systems from day one and lock them into your organization. And so they're basically, you address the issue of theft, you address the issue of how to protect data, and also from a compliance standpoint, you put in an environment that is not only compliant, but you can actually have the necessary mechanism to audit it. So let's go take a closer look in terms of what this is, in terms of how Autopilot really works. So I have some pictorials to look at in terms of the cloud and get an idea of what you have. And the way Windows Autopilot really works, you think it's really based on Intune. And there's a cloud service that actually helps manage this in terms of functionality. So when the IT admin comes through, the IT admin will basically get the necessary information. Let's say they call up Dell or they call up Microsoft and they're buying, 10 Surfaces or, 10 Dell systems. Dell will provide them the necessary, what we call the model IDs of that equipment and the unique serial numbers associated with them. And then what that IT admin does is automatically basically configures them into the Intune configuration for device deployment. And so when the profile get setting up, then basically it's a lot of things happen in the background. So when the manufacturers basically start deploying sending the devices out to the individuals, you now have an integration of that device gets tied to that business. Now, I said that device gets tied to the business. It's very important because what happens when you actually have an Autopilot enabled environment, you cannot reset a device. The end user cannot reset a device unless the IT admin allows them to do it. So if they go through and manage to reset the device and put a new image on it, the minute it comes online again, it's going to revert back into the Autopilot configuration. That's how tight the controls are. And you look in terms of how this happens in syncing, and from our organization, you're going to have capabilities of basically say that I'm going to have necessary configurations or images that I want to push out and dynamically configured for those environments. And that's what will happen. So when that device ships directly to the end user, it's already pre-configured based on the configuration that the IT admin has decided to do that. Now think of an organization that you actually have. You're replacing, even internally, it's maybe you're not using remote users, but just internally your office space environment you have. You may come through and by the time you actually configured all the information on it, literally you have situations where someone's device has failed, you bring them a new device, They resync up in Autopilot. The images are dynamically installed on them, and all the data is backed up from their OneDrive and restored in the configuration. That's the environment that's being put in place. And when you talk about the way Autopilot works, it comes up what we call this out-of-box experience and syncing up the data, syncing up the configuration, and basically doing the necessary enrollment to make sure it's tied into the environment. And really the minimum licenses you need from it is really tied down to, it's really you have to have version Windows 10 of 1803 later, which is everything is pretty much that way. And you have to have Active Directory Premium, ADP1 license, and also Microsoft Intune, which is included in all like the MS365 Business Premium, the E3, E5 suites. It's all standard part of that MDN deployment. Now, the interesting thing that we have is when you actually start enabling an Autopilot environment, and like ourselves at KAMIND, we actually have contractors which we bring on board, and we supply them not with devices, but we supply them with virtual PCs. And guess what happens? You can put that same virtual PC into that same environment. So the whole environment becomes enabled and controlled. So you have a controlled environment for contractors, you have controlled environments for devices, and it's all about controlling data to make sure the data resides with the company. And that's really critical, especially with compliance. You remember that I talked about that story about what happened with OHU with that laptop that was stuck in the seat. Could you imagine if they actually had an Autopilot configuration saying, yeah, no problem. We wiped this system remotely. No, there was no PII information that was PHI information that was lost on it, and their fine would have gone away because they had the necessary processes and procedures in place to basically manage the environment. That's what this means. So you start looking at these situations, you start looking at organizations, you start looking at how you do work, and you want to actually really figure out the best way to actually control it. Now, when you talk about Autopilot, give you an idea of the register. We talked about there are really two ways to register. As a individual, you can actually, you go and register in your Office 365 tenant. If you're working with a partner such as KAMIND, we actually register a device for you. Now, if you look at, I have a tag right here. This is a Surface tag, for instance. And what you have on the Surface tag on the right-hand corner, you have something known as a Microsoft Product ID. Well, the Microsoft Product ID is used to identify that unique product. Dell has them, HP has them for those systems. So you have situations for newer hardware, stuff that runs like Windows 10 and Windows 11 now, is you have Microsoft Product ID, a unique code that you can get for every piece of hardware. For older hardware, you can actually go through and compute a hash to make sure you have a hash that basically that's unique to the hardware to do the configuration for basically Windows 10, 1803 or later. So that's really that's really the secret. Now let's go look at the setup. Now the setup is, I'm going to give you two different ways to set up, but in reality it's easy as 1, 2, 3. You got to purchase the correct license. You got to choose to say how do you want to have your profile set up, and then you load the equipment in the partner center. That's literally what you have to do for it. There's nothing else. And the key thing that you want to do, especially with all the changes that are happening right now, you want to basically make sure that everything you buy is compatible, that runs Windows 11, that has the right TPM chipset and the right security chipset. Now, looking at step one, buying the licenses. I mentioned this a little earlier. It's basically, Business Premium is a very popular one for small business below 300 users. But on larger businesses, you have basically F3, the 365, E3, and E5. You can use the EMS or any Intune license. And if you actually go look at if you go into Partner Center, go into your tenant and look under Device, you'll see this Autopilot basically configuration screen. And so in the Autopilot, in this case, I have some systems in here. You have ability of those devices. I can select them, remove the company data. I can do a factory reset of the device and define when we're talking factory reset, That's to the point that if I wanted to, I can actually wipe and erase data at the same time. Of course, you can actually delete it, but you don't typically want to delete a device if you want to maintain ownership. Now in this list, you notice this is CPC system here. These are virtual PCs that are automatically configured into it. So let's go look at some of the configuration a little bit more to give you an idea. And there's really two choices that you have. And I listed these as approach 1 and approach 2. So what we'll do is approach 1 is basically, this is how you would go through traditionally, send it through a Microsoft MDM management, doing Intune configuration. And approach 2 does the same thing, but basically gives you a wizard to do it. So if you want to have more customizations, you basically, how you actually set up Autopilot, and there's really like 5 screens. You go into the Endpoint Manager under Windows Enrollment, and what you're actually is you're going to go for the configuration of the Autopilot users. And actually expand that is basically you're going to have different profiles that you actually have. Now, if you're doing stuff in HoloLens, like we're doing ourselves, you select what you're trying to do, either a Windows PC or HoloLens. And then you start building the configuration that meets the need. Now, you notice that this thing, the join type here, Azure AD is very important because when you actually have an Autopilot device that's Azure AD join, and that's linked to a client's tenant, that can only have users that are in that client tenant with that email address that basically are authorized to basically use that device. So, and many of you have remembered the out-of-box experience. You get a brand new Windows PC, it comes up and you say, okay, type in your is this a work or personal account? Well, if Autopilot devices are going to come up saying, please enter your work email address. And then the next screen will come back and say, please enter your password. So, and if you go through, and then it will actually start the enrollment. And if you get to the point that that user account's blocked or not able to log in, they will not complete the process and it will basically be bricked and there's nothing you can do. Keyboard's dead, everything's dead. And so the other aspect is when you actually get those profiles, you actually go set that, I want to set that configuration. So I'm going to go set that profile up. So you define a test profile. And remember earlier I said that when do you set this type of character, what type of experience do you want the end users to have? It's all done in this out-of-box experience. So you set up the different types of configurations that you want to have. What do you allow in your organization to do? And that's really the extent of Autopilot. When you look at the configuration, the next step you assign it to, if you can do 2 choices, you can actually have it open to all enrollments into your organization, or you can actually have devices that are specific to a group. So in essence, you have ability to take a device, hey, it's available to anyone in the organization, or it's only available to a small subset of the organization. But in all cases, what you have done, you've taken that Autopilot device and you've locked it from theft. And you have the ability to force how encryption's done, the ability to force all those compliance standards that you need to do. Now, the second way to do it, so that's the first approach, going to the endpoint manager. The second approach to do it is it's very similar, but a little bit different, is that you upload a list of the devices that you actually have. In this case, there's a template you download and you basically go select the model ID and you put it into it. And the next step is a really complex one. You make a decision and you have to pick the profile like we decided earlier, and you have a choice of 2 things. Do you want to have the privacy settings? Do you want to restrict administrative rights to the unit? So now you have deploying a Autopilot device, you have deployed it where you actually, for the generic user, you have restricted the administrative ability of the user to do things as a local admin, and you have tight controls up. So you have controller data, controller the applications. From a compliance, it's really a compliance dream because you're managing the entire thing. Now, behind the scenes, what happens is Microsoft makes some decisions for you. When you actually do the option 2 model, you configure a lot of these options were available in the approach 1, the out-of-box experience, but they're already pre-configured for you. So you basically are setting it up to optimizing for the user to basically go get online as fast as possible. So you skip the OneDrive configuration, the OEM register, because all that information is done. You basically, in terms of, you kind of structure it so that branding is tied into your organization. So when you actually have the out-of-box experience, and if you have customized your 365 tenant with Azure AD, you're going to see that customization on that device. So it's going to be branded. And also, from a standpoint, it's going to be managed by the auto enrollment from MDM. So as you go through, if you have like a generic set of MDM criteria, it's going to be placed on it. If you have more stringent ones in terms of, what type of, how do you actually want to access the USB? What do you allow on it? What Wi-Fi? What VPN configurations? All those things can be configured for that using through Autopilot. Autopilot is just a service that runs on top of what you're doing. So really the only questions you have, because this configured Autopilot, this is automatic in the Approach 2. And the only options you really have is, hey, go through the privacy settings or don't allow the user to become a local admin. That's it. And then once those are configured, when the user boots up the environment and rolls in, it's going to set up the device for work. And so it's the same out-of-box experience. You have a much controlled model that you want to actually run with. So how do you manage things? That's kind of the biggest questions that we actually have that people ask us. And the management is basically really simple. You have to keep in mind what Autopilot really is. When you actually look at Autopilot and what it actually leverages, it really leverages the collection of virtual policies. So the policies that you have, like when we actually deploy an environment for like Intune, for instance, we'll have compliance policies, we'll have security policy, we'll have configuration policies, and we'll have a group of policies to define how we want that device to operate. If it's a BYOB device, bring your own device. If it's a company-owned device, we have ways to manage it. And this is a whole thing when you start actually doing this virtualization and you start looking at the virtualization of policies, you may find that you have a group of devices already configured out into the field. And suddenly that there's a change in terms of, our compliance structure. So you have to do new policies. You have to change that Windows image. So how do you go about doing that? Well, in Autopilot and Intune, you just reconfigure it and basically adjust the policies, and the policies are automatically pushed out. You don't have to re-image things. You don't have to rebuild everything. So you look at the amount of time that you actually save in organization and management is significant. Now, how do you actually move Autopilot between users? Well, it's really simple. It's very straightforward. Locally, you can actually force it into a controlled reset that will go into a factory reset and reboot the system. Or as an administrator, you can do this remotely. Keep in mind is that the devices are tied to the organization 365 work account. They are tied to the work email addresses. So a user can go reset their device if they want to, but they're not going to go in and basically put a different user account on it. It's going to be structured and it's going to be built in as a work device. And then, like I said before, you're going to see the same type of screen as you go through the reset process. It's the same it's going back and it's going to re-enable the users, put all the data back on just like it was before, whatever the user count was said. Now, if you had a situation where basically you had the terminated user and you want a device back, you block that user from login. And what happens is the device stays in this mode. It's totally unusable. And you have, and then you just kind of, you manage it like any other asset. Now, one of the features you have when you actually go look in terms of the, device management, and I hided some things, you have different types of ability. You have ability to actually reset the devices. This is like the MDM panel that you actually have with the Microsoft Defender, Defender for Business, Defender P1 and P2. Those capabilities are pushed out there. So now you have the ability to basically manage, scan things from a centralized location, basically operate with a live response and basically run queries on devices as an administrator. You have a lot of capabilities. You don't really need that admin account on those boxes anymore. So it's kind of totally changed the way we do things. So that's one way you can actually look at it. The second way you actually see it is through in the Autopilot Center itself. And what I've done here is I just gone through and said, okay, what devices do I have in here? Here's a list of devices. Here's who the users assigned to them, and basically when they're last synced up. And if you look in terms of what I have to do, I can go through and reset the device. I have control over the device from the basically 365 Admin Center. Now, those are capabilities that have been in place. Now, if you're depending on your license, Microsoft has been extending. I just brought a couple of screenshots up here for just to give you a picture. If you actually go in your 365 tenant underneath the setup, you'll see a whole bunch of new configurations. Because one of the things that Microsoft did is we went through this whole license configuration in knowing from NCE, this new customer, new commerce experience. They made some changes with the endpoint. So now if you actually they actually added endpoint for Defender for Business is now part of Business Premium. Endpoint P1 is part of MS365 E3s, and endpoint P2 is part of MS365 E5s. So what you've done is they kind of merge these pieces together. And the reason why I bring this up, because when you start having Autopilot devices, you have control to push out, what is the configuration for the MDM configuration? What is the configuration for the security? What is the configuration for scanning? So you just not have the ability you have the ability to totally manage the device and actually manage and deal with the configuration and deal with the threats on it, and deal with the very aggressive threats, especially with the cyber war that we're actually seeing right now that is really going to engulf the world. And so we have to really stay on top of things. So that's what you have in terms of Autopilot and the pieces. Now, I had some slices on, we're just about wrapping up. I had some things about the price changes. I'm not going to spend too much time on them. We all know there's price changes. They're effective on March 1st. I just want to remind everyone key things when you do about the way Microsoft is doing licensing. There's now 3 types of license terms: monthly, annual, and 3-year. And you have to be very cognizant that there's a 72-hour change period. In the old license days, we would actually go through and you can do prorated add and removes. Those days are gone. You have a 72-hour window when you do changes. So keep it in mind as we go. We're putting some new portals that will come online. We'll actually make sure the users are aware of that so you don't do a dumb mistake. Because one of the things you want to do, we want to be worried about if you signed up for a 36-month subscription of let's say an Office E3 at $20 and you signed up 10 or 100 users and you made a mistake and you discovered it 5 days later, you're still are responsible for the payment of that entire thing through term. So you have to be very careful. And we're putting a bunch of checks and balances to make sure to catch things so no one does dumb mistakes. I mean, it's for myself, every now and then I'll get that Amazon gift card and I just kind of click on it. For some reason, my security software won't let me take it. But we're trying to put the same type of things in place to make sure that when you make changes, you're aware of the changes. And so if we have to make adjustments, we can do them in the time frame we need to. So what is the next steps that you need to do for Autopilot? Well, it's really very simple. You got to deploy a Business Premium, or you're going to have to deploy a license with Microsoft Intune. That's really the choice. And then what you actually do is you just go start and enable Autopilot. You go into your device center and you basically click on Autopilot and you just go from there. And that's how simple and straightforward it is. But we understand some folks will need some help with that. So we have a couple of offers available. So, we have a starter kit that will help you to get some pieces in place. We also have security assessments and some other things as well. But the goal is to basically, like KAMIND's philosophy is, we want to educate our clients as best as we can so that you can take advantage of these things and go forward. Upcoming webinars that we actually have, it's basically we have our CM&C webinars. It's coming on. We're doing the best approach. This is on the 24th, next 2 weeks from now. And then the fun one is I'm looking forward to is April 14th. This is going through the Microsoft security stack and the kill chain and really doing an understanding to see what the pieces and how everything layers on top of each other. Because it's when you look in terms of how things and how you want to address threats, you have to be constantly looking at ways to basically make sure you collect data, make sure you're analyzing what's going on, and you actually take a remediation as fast as you can. So a quick call to action, and then we'll open up for questions. If you're looking for security set, sign up for a security segment, contact us for auto deployment. And basically, if you're not using Business Premium, use Business Premium or use one of the MS365 suites. And let's get the autopilot environments out there so protect your business assets, because that's what you want to do. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Mike, and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Matt. Excellent job. So yeah, we've come a long way. Some of you might remember the old MSCCM, the Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager, where we ran around with CD images, imaging machines. Now we've moved to this web-based world of Intune and Autopilot, where we use virtual policies. And I think one of the coolest things about it is as updates come along, you can push those out via Autopilot. So, it's a push technology, and you can just deploy it out with the push of a button. Pretty easy. Anyways, I'm sure you guys have some questions, so feel free to use the chat. If you want to unmute yourself and ask away, please go for it.
Well, I have a couple questions if I could. I'm curious on the third for pushing out the OS and Office. I would imagine is going to be fairly within the realm of possibility here. What about third-party applications?
You can push it. Okay, so in terms of like the Microsoft MDM, you can actually push out third-party applications. A lot of it comes down to can you actually build the necessary install scripts to actually push it out? And when you look at MDM applications in general, most people think of like mobile devices, either an iOS or an Android. And what happens with those, they go through the devices, and pushing out the applications are actually through the company store, through iOS store, the Android store. In terms of desktop applications, we do this all the time. We actually load the desktop applications in the Microsoft company store. And so that's enable users to selectively actually download them, install them, or if the Autopilot configuration and the MDM configuration set up to actually do it, it will actually go install it. As an example, common, for us, we have a common set of apps we use. We use like the Cisco Umbrella, for instance, because Microsoft Web Defenders, it's just coming online, and we use Cisco Umbrella in the short term. So we push that out. That's a third-party app. We also do in terms of remote access software. We actually use sometimes a version of LogMeIn. We push that out. And there's other applications that you may need to push out. Those just need to get loaded through the management portal. Adobe is constant, one of the ones that applications are pushed out all the time.
Great question. So Joel has a question in the chat here. He's asking, if we restrict the user from local admin and I have to remote into a computer to provide support, how do I perform the tasks that require admin rights?
Well, when you actually restrict the user for local admin, so when you actually look at Autopilot, you have the ability the way Autopilot works is that you have remote access tools that you can come in as a system admin. And you can do those things as a system admin through the Endpoint Manager Center right now. And in some cases, what we have is that we have situations where you may actually have to go and put a local admin account on that unit. And you can actually push out a local admin account through the proactive script management through Endpoint Manager Center. That's how we do it.
Hopefully that answered your question, Joel. If not, just let us know and we'll try again. So Nate has a question. Can you control how the computer is named and which OU it gets added to from AD? each of our OUs need its computer to get named in a specific way?
Yeah, so you have naming rights. You have to look in terms of when you do the autopilot configuration, you basically it's an Azure join. So your environment by definition is going to be an Azure hybrid joined environment. So that's the way your environment's going to be set up. It's not a pure, you're not thinking of autopilot as a pure AD environment because you need to have the cloud resource. So in order to actually, so when you think about the way Azure AD is set up, is that you're actually linking the Azure AD and Office 365 together so they're seamless. And when you actually do the configuration, if you look at devices, devices are going to be loaded. When you actually go through and load a device profile, you can actually look at the configuration on the 365 and see where it is in Azure AD and define what the group that's associated with it, because that's how it's actually going to appear from the OU standpoint. Now, the issue you run into is that if you don't have, and the best way to look at that is take your current environment and basically make sure you have Azure Hybrid joined enabled, go into Azure Active Directory, look at the way the devices are configuration and what group structure they're part of. That's how that's how it's done.
All right, and we got more questions coming in here. So while we're waiting for the questions to show up in the chat, I might mention that we do have a feedback form to fill out. And if you do, you get entered for a raffle gift. And last Microsoft webinar, Chris Thomas of Essex Construction, he won the Rocketbook. All right, got another question here from Lee. Does Autopilot use GPO already configured in the environment, or does current GPO need to be imported to Autopilot somehow?
Yeah, so what's really happened is that you have to look at your GPOs and start saying that what's going to be move them, make them modern, and basically move them to Azure AD so they're managed out of that environment, because that's the key thing. GPO is more of an on-prem, local on-prem AD. So when you actually do an MDM configuration, you actually have all the ability to do pretty much like 98% of what you would do with a GPO. And Microsoft target is to make it 100%, which is very fastly coming in broad.
Yeah, good question, Lee. All right, any more questions in chat, or again, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. Got another chat coming in here.
Yeah, one thing that keep in mind as the environments are changing, you're going to see a push to go to zero trust networks. When you start looking at zero trust, you start asking the question of my users, which users do need to access my AD environment? Which users need to actually access the cloud resources and the SaaS services? And so you start really looking at your organization to figure from where I'm going to put my security walls in place. And then even from a point of what type of devices do I really need on-prem anymore? Do you actually make them you start using Azure Virtual Desktop or like the Windows 365 virtual cloud PCs like we do?
All right, Joe has a 4-part question here. Thanks, Joe. Number 1, does a process create a local user?
When autopilot gets enabled, it goes through a process where the users that initially log onto the system are admin, and then they get slowly transitioned over to an end user. So there's not a process of a local user. It's basically a Azure AD joined user is the way it's viewed.
Okay. Then his next question is there a way to confirm whether we have a P1 or P2 license?
So it's that's typically more like a P1 license. You only really need a P1 license for Autopilot. So I'm not quite sure the understanding, but A business premium has an Azure AD P1. MS365 E3 has an Azure AD P1 license. The MS365 E5 and the Security E5 add-on has a P2 license in it.
If you have questions about that, Joe, just let me know and I can help you. And then the third question here, can this configure the BIOS or UEFI?
Yeah, so you have with, that's you start getting into the MDM configuration. So under MDM configurations, like what we do, we have requirements. So say, okay, you got to run BitLocker, you have to do secured boot. So you have those configurations that are part of the Microsoft MDM configurations that we do. So the way we think of, so they really think of Autopilot as a service and MDM as the compliance and security management behind it. So when we actually do a Autopilot deployment, for instance, we have a MDM configuration. We have an MDM compliance in terms of have to have antivirus, have to have TPM chip, have to have this, have to have that. And then we have a MDM configuration that goes on top of it, which is saying must do BitLocker, must basically do secure boot, and some other BIOS type features on it. And then we add our security compliance, which means you have to run the Defender for P2 endpoint. You have to basically do these scans. You have to do the registration. So you basically layer. So you build that layered environment to manage the device, and you use Autopilot to basically push it out. So think of Autopilot as a service more than anything else.
And then as fourth question, does this have bandwidth control?
That one I'll have to take a look. There is some bandwidth controls on it, but I'd have to actually get back to you on that one.
All right, and we added a fifth. What are the safeguards for blowing away the wrong machine, like technician error?
Hope you have good business processes. I mean, if you have a technician that goes in, blows away a wrong machine, there's checks that go through that make sure, say, are you sure you want to do this? But at the end of the day, if someone says yes, then that activity will happen. Which is why Microsoft has basically, you'll start seeing this in the next couple months. There's a much more granular global admin or admin status, so you can actually have which people have authorizations to do different tasks. And you'll see that being popped out in a couple months, because that is a big issue. How do you make sure that, how do you trust the people to do the right thing, or how do you train the people to make sure they don't do dumb things? And we all know that we never do dumb things. And so I just want to, and I know I'm not guilty of that.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, any more questions via chat, or again, feel free to unmic and unmute, I should say. And I also put my email in the chat. So if you guys think of something down the road, or you want a copy of the slide deck or the video recording, whatever you need, let me know and I can get that to you.
Yeah, and we post all our videos, our material up on YouTube as well.
Yep. Good point. Getting a few thank yous. You're very welcome. All right, Joe is on a roll here. Cool. Can we image multiple PCs simultaneously, like in a lab, or is it just a serial approach?
No, you can do multiple at a time. What happens is that if you want to, you can have multiple system goes through. That's not an issue. What a lot of people do is they'll put different policies into different groups, and so they have different configurations. So, and think of things as what when you actually look at this, this is trying to leverage a lot of the existing Windows 10 infrastructure for resetting devices. So it's not really, once you actually get a base image or structure, you have the policies built into it. And we'll probably have another webinar talking about Cloud PC. And what that is when you look at the Microsoft infrastructure, you have Autopilot's a delivery mechanism, MDM is a device management, and then you have something called Cloud PCs, which is the profile management. So what you have when you think about an image, when you do an image, for instance, you want to actually, hey, remove the start menus, do this, do add, get rid of the games and all those type of things. So what we'd like to try people think about is use MDM to do more device management of things you need the device to do. And then you basically run a Cloud PC profile on top of it to basically say, okay, let's get rid of all the games. Let's get rid of all this. So you're not really imaging, you're just removing those functionalities and disabling from being installed by the user, which speeds up the whole process of deployment of devices. And,
All right.
and that's how Windows 365 PCs are deployed in the cloud.
Another question. What is the not touching every PC process to gather the serial number for the existing fleet, and then to add the current fleet into Autopilot?
So there's really two steps on it. If you have a current hardware that's already out in the field, and they don't have a Microsoft product ID associated with them, then you're going to have to touch them and generate a hardware hash. There's no way to get around that. And that hardware hash is used to load in the Autopilot Center. If it's a brand new PC that you just called up from like KAMIND, or if you get it from Dell or Microsoft or CDW, you have to request the product ID and the hardware hash in an Excel spreadsheet, and they'll supply that because the manufacturers now actually do this if it's Autopilot enabled. So you could actually go put an order in for 100 surfaces, for instance, and request that you get the product ID and serial numbers for the 100 surfaces when they're shipped. Microsoft will send that to you, ship them to wherever you want to do. So basically, you just take that information and now just enter them into the Autopilot configuration. And it's basically a CSV spreadsheet that you upload into the device center.
But presumably we should be able to do some PowerShell wizardry to gather that rather than hit every machine.
Yeah, well, you still have the hashes unique to each machine.
Right.
So you have to basically do it as an administrator to actually get the hash. If the stuff is deployed, there's no way to get around that.
Great questions, Joe. So got another question coming in from Mr. Brian Foley. Can Autopilot push a clean image of Windows, or does it just use the Windows that came on the PC and use the built-in reset function?
It basically, you have two options that you can actually do. If it's user generated, then the user select, do you want it from the current image or the other image? If you do it from a central console standpoint, you can force it to cloud sync.
Good question.
I mean, in general, what we do, the problems you run into, and reason why you want to have that option, if you buy a retail PC, the retail PC will have Office, will have Windows Home on it. And in order to actually use Autopilot, you have to have Windows Pro. And in certain situations, if you've gone through and added a Windows Pro key to it to basically upgrade it, then if you actually do a complete reset with a cloud download, you'll wipe out that Windows Pro key and have to re-put it on there. But if you do reuse the image of the device, then it will come back correctly. And keep in mind, the reset of the image is basically trying to capture the current image.
Great questions today, guys. We probably have time for one more, and then we'll be back to the top of the hour. So You're sitting on that one question you wanted to ask. Now's the time. Got one coming. Or maybe not. Anyways, we're almost at the top of the hour again. We thank you for your time today. We appreciate your interest in Intune and Autopilot. You know how to get a hold of us. Please take a minute, give us feedback on the forum, and enter to win a raffle prize. And we might have one last question squeezing in. Another thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for attending today. Well, with that, we'll give you back the rest of your day. And again, appreciate your time. And hopefully we'll see you all on the next KAMIND webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.